Good morning, Bridget. It's good to see you. I'm with Bridget Duffy this morning, the Chief Medical Officer of Vocera. Good to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Tell us, for those of you who don't know your wonderful background, would you tell us a bit about your background, and then we'll dive into a topic that both of us are very passionate about.
Absolutely. I'm a physician by training and had a very different path as a doctor about 20 years ago. It was one patient that woke me up that I could do things different as a doctor. And as I walked into the room and I watched doctors deal with the fragmented, broken, diseased patient and deal with the machines that dealt with the body parts, I thought, my patient's not diseased and fragmented, the system is. So I read an article that day written by an engineer, and he said, why don't we treat patients as whole human beings, not as broken and diseased body parts? So I called up this person. I thought, this is brilliant. He'd happened to retire, go to Hawaii. His name was Earl Bakken. He invented a pacemaker and founded a little company called Medtronic. So he and I have been on a 20-year journey to help humanize the way we care for patients. So that work led me to being the nation's first chief experience officer at the Cleveland Clinic about 9 years ago. And now my passion at Vocera as the chief medical officer for the past 6 years is to help humanize the healthcare experience by improved communication. The number one thing broken in healthcare is communication. Patients don't know who their doctor is. They don't know who their nurse is. They're not listened to. They're not treated with dignity. They're not treated with respect. And they're not involved in the design process. So my passion at Vocera is to solve for the piece that's broken around communication before people arrive and after they leave.
I find it so interesting that sometimes we have these spark moments that put us on a path to really make a difference. But you used the word broken a couple of times. And why do you think the patient experience and the design around that has been so ignored in healthcare from what you say, frankly, too long?
The patient experience has been broken because we don't design the system for people. And that's why I was so excited to meet you and be here and so in awe of Intermountain taking it on to design for people. The other thing broken in healthcare, besides the patient experience and communication, is the pain of doctors and nurses. We have an epidemic in this country around burnt out doctors and nurses. More doctors and nurses my age are leaving healthcare, and they shouldn't be. And that's because we don't design the system or the ecosystem for them either. And we inflict technology after technology on them. So the fact that you're designing for people, meaning doctors, nurses, and patients, and involving them in the design process, you will ease the burden of being a doctor or nurse. You will make them more efficient. You will help create a safer environment. And only then will you improve the patient experience, if you improve the care provider experience.
So we've talked a bit about kind of the old way of doing it, really. And I want to know your thoughts on what do you feel about patient advisory counselors or family councils? Where does that fit? Should it fit? What do we need to do to change it? Just in that kind of realm of thinking, what do you think?
I think patient and family advisory councils should be disbanded. I think it's insulting to a patient when we walk in and ask them to rubber stamp a design for a lobby or a new feature in an emergency room. I think, and you'll hear from the guru in the world around human-centered design, Michael Sears, I think, as you'll hear from him, we need to embed patients as experienced design fellows, as equal partners paired with a doctor and a nurse from the beginning to the end of the design process, and not bring in patients to just check a box or react to something that we've designed in a prototyping process. So I think get rid of the patient and family councils that sit up here to sort of bless something, embed them in the trenches, and then once that project is done, disband that group and bring in new patients for the next project that you're taking on.
I think that's fascinating. It's always, I have worked at other large companies outside of the provider, but it's always intrigued me why we bring people into a conference room or get them on a conference call and we're completely out of the context of where the progress is happening, but yet we design in these fake environments. And it's always kind of intrigued me about why do we do that?
I think it's because we've always done it that way, and
Yeah.
I think what you're doing is so disruptive. You're actually having people roll up their sleeves, walk in the shoes of each other. It's
Yeah.
only then can you map the gaps or the pain points and understand the hassles in a doctor's and nurse's day, or understand the moments that most touch a patient's heart to
Yeah.
ease their burden. I think so often in healthcare, we add to the burden of illness versus taking away. From
Yeah.
the parking valet to the check-in process. On check-in, the first thing we ask them is, where's your insurance? Do you have a living will?
Sure.
And where's your copay?
Yeah.
But when you listen to patients, they want to know, have you asked them, what are your greatest fears or concerns, and how can we ease your burden of illness?
Yes.
And when you do that, you'll come up with things like, instead of informed consent before a surgical procedure, one patient said to us in the design process, what about informed hope? Why don't you tell me all the things that can go right
wow.
before you put me to sleep? Overnight in operating rooms, that should be a new clinical standard. Embedded in the electronic record or on a paper. And as soon as you do informed consent, put that clipboard aside and institute the informed hope. That transforms the patient experience and around the operating room experience. There's 100 of those things that could become an always event versus a never event in healthcare that humanizes the patient experience. But that will only happen if you design for people in laboratories like yours.
What I find interesting, or maybe I have this feeling that empathy is the heartbeat of healthcare. This has been, I think, one of your messages for a very long time now. I sometimes feel we've lost track of that health should bind us, and it seems to pull us apart a little bit politically and what have you. But how do we get back to what you've been talking about for a long time, and that's an empathetic stance toward each other and the caregivers and clinicians, whoever's in that mix of helping me be healthy? How do we get back to it?
Every other industry besides healthcare understands that you have to create empathy and an emotional connection to your customers to drive loyalty.
Yep.
Apple does that. Uber does that. Google does that. Amazon Prime does that. We've been slow to understand that in healthcare, and I think often it's viewed as soft or fluff. I know I was met with great resistance when I walked in and talked about creating a healing environment and restoring empathy back to healthcare.
Yes.
They looked at me at my first institution and said, Bridget, we are a data-driven, results-oriented organization. We don't use words like empathy or healing. And I looked at this chair of the department and I said, I know you don't use those words yet. That's why I'm here. And in fact, my title was the Chief Empathy Officer first before it became the Chief Experience Officer. So empathy is important. It's around the purpose of why we as doctors or nurses entered the field in the first place.
Yes.
But why it's absent today is we're burning out doctors and nurses through technology that does not enhance their life and broken processes. So when you have burnt out and emotionally exhausted doctors, they don't have empathy. They depersonalize and objectify the patient. So we start referring to the patient as the pancreatitis in room 302. So if you can create and design for people, you will naturally restore empathy. I believe people are born with that and they enter the field of medicine with empathy. I think we beat it out of them on the floor. But if we can design for people, empathy will come back and it will reconnect people back to purpose for why they entered healthcare in the first place.